Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It's time once again for me to take some time to give thanks to the living God for specific friendships that he has blessed me with along the way. And as happened a week or two ago, I'm afraid that this is one where I'm not going to be able to give you the full name, and it's definitely one where I'm not going to be able to send an encouraging message to this friend. We will call him Andy. And I suspect many of you probably have had a friend like Andy. Andy and I met when we were both students at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando. And Andy had already spent a year or two studying at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. And when RTS opened its Orlando branch, he transferred there, and that was at the very beginning, and I was there at the very beginning. And Andy and I became friends. Andy was the son of a psychiatrist. He had grown up in Mississippi and had attended Belhaven College there in Jackson, Mississippi, where he was friends with other friends of mine as well. But Andy was this kind of fellow. This is why I say you may have had someone like this in your life. He was the kind of fellow who, at one and the same time, was deeply winsome and charming and entertaining, but also not especially what's the word for it? I would guess the word for it would be successful. I mean, Andy was plenty smart, but this is the kind of thing, this is true of Andy, this is the kind of thing that Andy did. When you went to Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, I don't know if this is still the case, but when I went, you had to not only do all of your coursework, but you had to pass a fairly comprehensive English Bible exam at the end of your studies. And it wasn't easy, but it wasn't a hurdle that was, designed to keep 25% or 10% even of the students from graduating. It was there, and if you studied diligently, you could pass it. In fact, there existed a study guide for it, so that you didn't have to know everything. You could study for the test. I studied for the test, and I passed the test. Well, Andy finished all of his coursework, but he just couldn't bring himself to take the test. He went years, probably decades, without ever taking that test. Again, an hour-long test, maybe an hour-and-a-half-long test. If he'd sat down, if he'd taken it, he would have had a master's degree, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he just hung around for a while, and then he moved back to Mississippi, and he got a low-end job at the Parks Department, and he had a kind of failure to launch kind of a problem. But he was just really clever and witty and fun. One of my favorite memories of him was that first year at Reformed Theological Seminary. In God's good providence, Dr. Roger Nicole, who had taught for decades at Gordon Conwell Seminary, and who was one of the most respected Reformed theologians in the world, and certainly was probably the world's leading Reformed bibliophile, lover of books. He not only came to teach at Orlando during his retirement, but he had given his massive top drawer library to the library at Reformed Seminary. And Andy had secured a job helping with the cataloging of those books and the shelving of those books. And one day I was in a class, one afternoon I'm in class. I don't remember what class it was. There's probably 30 of us in the classroom. The professor's lecturing, but an entire wall of the classroom is a glass window that looks out into this I don't know what you would call it, walkway between the building and the building next, right across the walkway. And Andy was doing the work of moving books from one building to another. He had this giant cart like you would see at Home Depot, and he would be covered with books, and he'd be pushing them across, and it would catch your eye because, you're in class and maybe you're getting a little bored. Well, he kept making multiple trips back and forth with these books, but every trip that he would make, he would wear a different hat. He would go by in a Santa Claus hat, and then he would come back the next time and come by in a fisherman's hat, and come back the next time and come by in a Russian Cossacks hat. I mean, all just one after another, and just very casual. Didn't look at us, just pushed the books but knew that we were watching him. That's the kind of guy that Andy was. And gosh, I just loved the man. The very first time I ever frequented a establishment that served Irish food, Andy was there and enjoyed that time with us. Andy came after I was out of seminary and visited from time to time, and just sort of came into my life and caught me up to date, and then went on. And then some of these other friends that I had over the years would also keep up to date with him. That the reason I can't reach him is because for all that charm and all that cleverness, Andy obviously struggled and eventually gave up the struggle and took his own life. It's astonishing to me. I didn't think when I was growing up that I would know multiple people who had done just that. That I would love multiple people who had done just that. But that is the case with my friend Andy. Let me encourage you again to contact your friends. Give thanks for them and to them. They may be struggling. You may not know. I know that, I would tell Andy, I would remind Andy, hey, Andy, you're my friend. We love you and we want the best for you. I didn't know he was having that level of a struggle, but we usually don't. So please take the time and make the effort to reach out to your friends and let them know you're grateful for them. I'm not saying it's the best company in the world, but in fact, I'd say it's not the best company in the world, but it's a place that I like to do business. And my whole family likes to do business. I'm guessing there aren't that many families like Lisa and my family, in that we're a family that when we're in a particularly grateful, jovial, happy mood, one of the things that we love to do is go to Barnes & Noble together. That's kind of our family outing, is to go to the bookstore. And we go there and we read and we get books. Well, I mention all that because we're here for another Curating Your Book Library segment. And I'm happy to report that I was able to read another book by an author that I have covered in these segments in the past. And I've mentioned as well that it is my habit to sort of collect authors or even musicians that if I like something by a particular author, I'm going to look for more by that author, or like something by a musician, I'll look for more by that musician. I realize that not everybody's like that, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say to me, "Oh, I loved your book." Well, I'm glad to know they liked one of my books, but there's a lot of them out there, and I'd like for them to read them. So I came back to this author that I've already covered twice before. His name is Erik Larson, and he is a historian. And his sort of calling card is that he has this capacity to write history that makes you feel like you're reading a novel, in the sense that just sort of the arcs and the ebbs and the flows and the drama of the story are just right there. And you feel like you're entering into a story. Well, I have in the past read and spoken with you about his book, The Devil in the White City, which was a book about the World's Fair in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century and the first United States serial killer who was active in that same context. And then we also covered, oh gosh, I'm having a hard time reading this title. I'm not sure why it's so dark, but there were another one about the fellow who served as ambassador to Germany around 1936, the American ambassador to Germany. Well, today I want to talk to you about his book, Dead Wake. The subtitle is The Last Crossing of the Lusitania. Now, most of us are probably a little bit more familiar with the sinking of the Titanic than we are the Lusitania. But I would suggest as big news as the sinking of the Titanic was, the sinking of the Lusitania was of far greater import. The Titanic ran into an iceberg and sank. The Lusitania was a ship of similar size. This was later, maybe 10 years after the sinking of the Titanic. This was a passenger ship, the biggest of its kind, the first passenger and fastest passenger ship for crossing the Atlantic Ocean. It had 4 funnels, and its sinking led directly to the United States joining the Great War, World War I. That war had raged on for multiple years without our involvement. There was a very strong isolationist segment, which would have included me at the time, that was very opposed to getting involved in Europe's war. There was a sense in which the folks that we would be more natural allies with were very eager to get us involved. And so there's a lot of speculation about what was known and what wasn't known. Well, Erik Larson doesn't really cover much of that, but he does just in a very powerful way give us the rundown, the history of the background of what's going on. The book kind of flops back and forth between what's going on the ship itself as it's crossing the Atlantic and what's going on in the German U-boat, that is submarine, U-20, that actually ended up sinking it. And we meet some of the characters. We find out why they're on the ship. We follow along with the code breakers who are listening in on the correspondence of the Germans, all sorts of good background, and he just has a real knack for zeroing in. It sort of reminds me, although this other fella is much more ideological, but it kind of reminds me of reading E. Michael Jones, who just has this unbelievable ability to find a true story in the life of a world-shaping character, and to tell that story and then show how that shaped his worldview. Probably most powerfully done in his book, Living Machines, on Bauhaus architecture. Anyway, Dead Wake is very compelling. Another excellent book by Erik Larson. I will say that it's the one on the World's Fair and the serial killer was still my favorite. It was the first one, and then the second one and the third one are a leg below the first one. But I've enjoyed them both. So let me encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested. And as always, let me know if you've read it. Let me know if you've read other Erik Larson books. There are still more that I haven't read, but give me time. I'll get to them. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe you've read another book by somebody else on this very story, The Sinking of the Lusitania. It's a very important story. So that's today's Curating Your Book Library, Dead Wake, The Last Journey of the Lusitania by Eric Larson. Was God wrong to command Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? Well, I think it would be wise for us to admit that there are any number of challenges that come from this account in Genesis. Some have used this story to deny God knows the future, basing it on God's declaration in 12:22, Genesis 12:22, "Now I know that you fear God." Some have used it to argue that God is wicked, either for asking the father to kill the innocent son, or for lying to Abraham, telling Abraham he wanted him to do something that he really didn't want him to do. The first objection is answered easily enough. Only God the Father has an innocent son. While Isaac may not have been guilty of a capital offense on the earthly civil sphere, from his conception, he stood guilty before the living God. God had every right to take Isaac's life and to call Abraham to be the means of that execution. Which leaves us with the question of God's honesty. Was it, or is it rather, sinful of him to give such a gruesome assignment when he had no intention of carrying it through? No. Remember that it was the same Abraham who, in another context, asked, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" when he was interceding for Sodom. If we know God has done something, we have our answer as to whether it was right or wrong. If it seems wrong to us, the problem is with us. God, we have to remember, isn't underneath some transcendent standard of goodness. Neither, however, is God above goodness. He's not arbitrary. Rather, God is the standard of goodness. He is rightly a law unto himself. Given the authority of God, given that what he asked of Abraham was not a sin, let us ask the question this way. Does God have the right to demand of you that you sell all that you own, give it to the poor, and follow him? Of course he does. Does he have the right to not ask you to do this? Of course he does. Does he then have the right to ask you if he intends to bless you with even greater wealth if you proceed to do so? Of course he does. God's request of Abraham is hard, challenging, even heart-wrenching. But if he had the right to carry through on it, and he did, surely he has the right to not carry through with it. Though in one sense God's question proved to be hypothetical, our response to it is not hypothetical. How we see this event may reveal our heart's posture toward God and our own well-being. It is true that God spared Isaac. It is true that God did not spare his own son. It is also true, however, that he calls each of us to leave all else behind and follow him. Every day, of every gift he has given me, I must confess, nevertheless, Lord, not my will, but thine be done.
You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.